This week, Emmet and I continue our discussion of Jack Kirby's Fourth World stories with the second half of his run on Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen. So many crazy ideas, but do they make a satisfying story? First, if you appreciate the work we do on Deconstructing Comics and our other podcasts, we'd love it if you'd support the show at patreon.com/deconcomics for as little as $2 a month. Check out our goals and rewards and pledge your support now at patreon.com/deconcomics. This is Tim.
This is Emmet.
And this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Tim in Tokyo with Emmet in country Victoria, Australia. I said it correctly. Didn't say anything about hopping mammals.
No.
How are you?
I'm well. Things are good here. We are just come out of a really, really hot time of year. It was sweltering hot, but we had a bit of rain and some storms, and now it's bearable. I'm not sweating into a puddle anymore.
Mm-hmm. For you guys there, it's like what we think of as
summer,
August.
Yeah. July, August type weather. Exactly.
Yeah.
Once again, a sort of constant reminder to me that I should not be in this country. I do not belong here.
It's February. I'm supposed to be freezing.
Exactly. It's supposed to be cold. It's supposed to be wet and slush everywhere on the roads. You know, that's what I'm used to. My best friend is the radiator at home. But no, it's very warm.
Okay, so we are continuing on with our look at Jack Kirby's Fourth World comics, and we're following the comicbookreadingorders.com reading order. So last time, which will be 2 weeks before you hear this one, we talked about Jimmy Olsen 133 to 141, and then Forever People #1. This time it's more Jimmy Olsen 142 through 148. I was kind of surprised that, in the first batch we got some Darkseid and some of that, and I felt like I was expecting there would be a lot more of that in this batch, but there wasn't all that much. Simeon and what's his name, Mokori, show up once, and we do have another boom tube,
yes,
like we saw in Forever People 1. Now we know why that was placed where it was in this reading order, because that bit was Superman in the boom tube, and seeing, what's it called, Supertown? Supertown. But yeah, I expected to see Darkseid all over the place, and he wasn't here at all.
Yes, and I think that's sort of interesting in that, he's probably been told, all right, can we just have some monsters? So we enter into the vampire bit in issue 142, which is a phrase that keeps reoccurring, and then we come to later on this the living dead bit. So this is the idea of it's a bit.
Well, it just occurred to me that vampire bit is a pun.
It's a pun, yeah, exactly. And it's on the cover as well. But it keeps coming up in dialogue. People keep saying it. But what I was just saying to you before we started recording is, I think I could make an argument for how this stuff with Count Dragorin and Transylvane and the Hollywood monsters and all this stuff relates to the New Gods in a, analogous way. But you're right, it sort of takes a bit of a breather from the New God stuff, and while Superman and Jimmy Olsen are dealing with this wonderful story, which I'm really hoping we spend a bit of time talking about, the Newsboy Legion get mixed up with Darkseid's henchmen in Scotland, as you mentioned, Simeon and Makari. And I find that interesting that, as I'm going through these issues, the Newsboy Legion keep that plot moving forward. There's lots of stuff with Intergang as well that's also relevant. Intergang relates to Darkseid. So, they're sort of keeping these things building and building. And really, it is Jack Kirby doing his take on a shared universe not an original take, I know, but I think it's fascinating to watch somebody at this time do that.
Mm-hmm.
And do it in such a way that it's a lot more provocative than, this character, you saw this character in issue 150 of Iron Man. Well, go over there and see what's going on there. This is different. This is kind of, here's some crazy stuff. We're not going to explain what it means to you. It may take a couple of years for you to realize what this was.
These comics are exhausting. It just feels like felt like overall story was secondary to just simply having crazy stuff happening and then more crazy stuff and the Transylvane was especially kind of mind blowing. Because I knew that this Transylvane was a planet that had vampires on it, so I thought, oh, they're going to go to space. No. This planet is like it's tiny by planetary standards, and it's hidden in a mausoleum in a cemetery, and all the people on it are like tiny, teeny people you can't see with the naked eye unless they come off of the planet and grow up to Earth person size. It's like, what?
And this is where I'd make the connection with New Gods. Because that's what the boom tube technology is all about. It's maximizing or minimizing the size of characters depending on what level of reality they're at.
Mm-hmm.
So Darkseid and his minions, when they arrive on Earth, and the Forever People, as we've seen in issue 1 of the Forever People, they look like people or monsters, but they look like people. You know, they're humanoid size, but they're actually meant to be much bigger, right? And humans are on a lower level of reality. And this is something that Final Crisis played with, this idea of these characters crashing into our reality. And there's no longer a sort of translation of them via boom tube. They just sort of crash into reality, and then reality sinks with them, which is a whole thing. We don't have to get into it right now. Transylvane, as you say, is a miniaturized reality that has been created in a lab, and Superman could potentially travel to there and become the same size as those creatures, and they can travel up to our reality and look like they're Dracula, Wolfman, Frankenstein characters.
Mm-hmm.
But that idea of a minimal universe is then analogous to the maximal universe, which is the New Gods and Apocalypse and all that stuff.
Okay.
So I think that's what he's doing. He's sort of created the spectrum of different realities. One is microscopic, one which is our size, and one which is much, much larger.
Yeah, and then in this batch of comics, there's a section where the characters are all shrunk down, and they go into this evil laboratory. That's actually what it's called. It's not a laboratory that creates evil. It's a laboratory that is evil. So I got to get the intonation right. The evil laboratory, I guess.
And then later on we have the evil factory as well, which is where Simeon and Makari
that's what I'm thinking of. Evil factory.
Yeah.
The evil the evil factory. Yeah. Okay.
I thought I'd missed a caption box.
No. I hadn't found it in my notes yet. Yeah. Factory. So, but then, like, the whole thing is tiny, and for a while I was thinking, are they back to regular size? And it just didn't tell us. But no, all of this stuff is microscopic. This whole building and Simeon and Makari and everything that's going on there, they're all microscopic at the time. And then Jimmy Olsen is turned into a caveman, and he's still microscopic when that happens. And then all this transformation is just undone off-panel between issues. Because we got to get on to the next thing.
It's crazy stuff. But let's...
In fact, I loved the end of issue 143 so much I put this panel in my notes where it's just words, and he says, perhaps someday soon we'll take a small trip to Transylvane and see the changes wrought by Superman's substitute psychology. And then in huge letters, but right now we can't. There's a story breaking, rumors flying. It just, it's just got to get on to the next thing. It's just... breathless.
I have this impression now of Jack Kirby as being the writer as engineer. You know what I mean? Like, he's assembling these ideas, and he's just having ideas and ideas and ideas. And the person I compare him to, for the benefit of the listener, to get a sense of what I mean by that, is Neil Stephenson, who's also somebody who just has this wide variety of interests. And if you read Neil Stephenson novels, I mean, early novels in particular, there's this sense of it all just barely hanging together with chicken wire. And then when you get to the Baroque cycle, his later novels, there's this sense of, you've got too many ideas, man. There's too much going on. And why I refer that as engineering is that the ideas take preeminence over anything else, right? Whereas you need somebody to come in afterwards and try and finesse it, right? Which is maybe what your Stan Lee would do. Or
direct traffic in terms of the ideas.
But what I think Jack Kirby had to deal with here is he had to deal with a sort of middle manager type who maybe wasn't able to finesse him and instead just sort of constrained him. So that ending, I love that ending. I love that idea of, okay, a world conditioned by cinema that is visible in the heavens.
Right. We haven't explained that part. The planet in the mausoleum is surrounded by these floating movie cameras that are projecting like classic monster movies so that they're seen in the skies of the planet. And so it's just been constantly doing that. And so the people start imitating those movies. And so they make themselves look monsters. Like vampires and wolfmen and Frankenstein monsters, and they travel around in these flying coffins.
And it's really sad as well, because they've also been made aware that there's an apocalypse coming for them involving this hound, and they are terrified of this happening. And that's what Count Gorin is trying to stop. He's trying to avert this apocalypse. He's trying to find the person responsible. They are aware that they live in this artificial world. They can escape it, but only individual. The whole world is going to be destroyed, and they're going to lose everything. So they're aware that they're being manipulated, but at the same time, they are taking on the traits of this media that's being broadcast to them in the sky. And I find that absolutely incredible. So, I mean, I was going to save this for later, but I quickly wanted to just throw this into the mix. This reminds me of a scene in The Matrix Reloaded. Did you ever see The Matrix Reloaded or any of the Matrix movies?
No, I saw the first one.
Yeah. So in the second movie, we are told by a character, I believe it's the Merovingian, we're told that there were many, many different matrices. Matrices? There were many different versions of the Matrix. And they weren't always ordinary reality, like set in the 90s, or what we would see as 90s, like America. There were versions of the Matrix where there were fantastical things. There were strange versions of the Matrix. And he doesn't really elaborate on that, but it's enough of an idea to give you a sense of, okay, so there were like worlds that were maybe a bit more fantastical, like a video game. And the problem was that humanity kept rejecting the fantasy. So they created a version of the Matrix where they would be sort of having to do this 9-to-5 drudgery. And humanity accepts that reality. They're like, oh, yes, of course. There's a scene in The Matrix Reloaded when Neo enters a room, and there's a television in the room, and it's showing a Hammer, I believe it's a Hammer horror movie. I think it's Sisters of Darkness. It's a vampire movie. And there are two characters in the room, and they're staring at the screen. And when we meet them, they turn to camera, and you get a flash of their teeth. So there's this implication that they are vampires. They're from a version of the Matrix where there were vampires. And they are obsessed with this vampire movie. They like watching themselves, right? And that's where I thought of this comic, that idea of constantly just watching this monster that you've been told you are. And then Monica Bellucci shoots them both with a silver bullet. And that's sort of making it explicit that they were undead. They were vampires because killing them with a silver bullet is how he killed them. It's not explained. Nothing else. This is never followed up on. We never see any more of these creatures from other realities, previous versions of the Matrix. They don't come up again. And again, I've compared that to Kirby because, like Kirby, I think the Wachowskis are people who had too many ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I still have a sneaking regard for the Matrix sequels that everyone dislikes, because I'm going, these folks are they're batting 1,000. Like, there's so much information here. I find that fascinating. So again, maybe they're also examples of creators as engineers. Like, the idea is delivered to you, but then there's no sort of trying to relate it to you. It's just, here, deal with that. Here's another one. Deal with that too. And I really enjoyed this. I really did. But as you said before you started recording, it's deeply weird.
As Kumar would say, it's bonkers. So we have that story for a couple issues, and then we get into this kind of Loch Ness Monster type of story, the Loch Trevor Monster, and
Brigadoon!
Part 2 is Brigadoon. 144 credits Jack Kirby. I thought that was funny.
Yeah.
And this Morgan Edge guy, the head of the Galaxy Broadcasting System, which bought the Daily Planet, it seems like he wants to kill Jimmy and the Newsboys, but he can only do it in highly convoluted ways that involve sending them off to some other part of the world so that his people can kill them. Why not just take care of them right there in your office or right there in Metropolis? I mean, he's sending them to Scotland to do this story, and I mean, it's not very efficient to hire like half a dozen people to go cover the story, and then on the phone with his people over there, don't fail. And of course they fail. But and of course Kirby, as I mentioned last time, and I put it in my notes again, he didn't really get to finish what he wanted to do here. And so, at least in this book, I don't know if Morgan Edge appears in any of the other books, but the character never really pays off. He's just kind of there, and you feel like something's brewing, and then it gets to 148, and it's all over. I mean, I don't know if the next writer did anything with it. Apparently, the next writer was... What did I put it in my notes? Jerry Siegel.
Oh, wow. Okay, they went for the classic.
So, yeah, I don't know if Jerry Siegel tried to pick up where Kirby left off or went in some completely other direction, but...
My understanding, and again, apologies to the listeners, I have not read as much Superman stuff as I probably should, although I'm really enjoying Superman's Pal, the new Jimmy Olsen by Jack Kirby, because it's so deeply weird. If I knew this was here, I would have been reading it years ago. But my understanding was that Morgan Edge was an ongoing concern. In that I think I knew people who were obsessed with Superman when I was growing up, and they were talking about him in the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
So I have to assume he comes back. And he sort of represents this new media, because he's all about television. Unless I'm confusing with a different character.
I don't know. I just looked up what the next issue looks like, 149, on fandom.com. Now, this is saying that the writer was John Albano, and the cover looks like, judging from the cover, it looks like this is a completely different story. It has nothing to do with maybe no Newsboy Legion or anything like that. There's a Plastic Man story in it, too. So, yeah, it looks like this story was just abandoned.
Yeah, and just reading ahead, it looks like, yes, Morgan Edge does continue to be a character. He's in Post-Crisis, he's in the U-52, he's been in a bunch of the animated shows and television, all that stuff. But the version of Morgan Edge that we're reading about is a dupe, a clone, created by Darkseid.
Oh, that figures.
From the Evil Factory, so there you go. So it's a completely different character, in effect. Retroactively, I assume.
Okay. Right, yeah, let's retcon everything. I don't know, we got into this Loch Ness Monster thing, and I was just kind of wondering, what's the point here? I wasn't quite sure. I mean, we end up with all these other monsters, too, have been created in the evil factory, but I don't know, there didn't seem to be any... Well, I couldn't find the point of the story.
It is just like evil super science gone mad. And it's sort of these comics, there is this continual idea about cloning, about miniaturization. He's dealing with quantum realities at different points. He's comic book super science. And I think the dark side elements are there just to represent science without any ethical concerns whatsoever. So that's what Macari and Simeon are doing. They're in Scotland. They're creating all these creatures. They're evolving and de-evolving people. You still have the DNA aliens in the mix as well. Kirby's clearly building to these two ideas of super science. You've got the Newsboy Legion sort of fritting around all these different versions of benevolent super science, and then you've got the Apocalypse characters, and they're the ones trying to control people, trying to turn people into weapons or monsters, or whatever. And that's sort of showing the lay of the land before we get to Darkseid versus Highfather. And I'm sure each of these stages are meant to be, again, analogous, or just one leads to the other, leads to the other, leads to the other. I think he's sort of building... It's just a canvas for Kirby to just throw amazing conceptions at us. That's all he's doing.
Yeah, just idea.
Right? But you're having trouble parsing it, and I find it's interesting, and I think that maybe relates to the struggles Kirby had editorially, where he's just excited to creating new toys, and it's not sticking for people.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted it to be leading to something, and I didn't feel like it had a direction to it. It was just sort of a showcase for all these ideas.
I feel he's also, I think you touched on this last time, but he's also trying to create a stable of characters and concepts for other writers and artists to come in and work with. So I think he's basically creating an entirely self-contained DC universe within the DC universe. And if you look at creators who've come on, I keep mentioning Morrison, but Jonathan Hickman as well is another one of these. There are creators now who are doing the same thing he did, but they have a little more nous in terms of parlaying it into some mainstream connectivity, if you like. Like the House of X, Powers of X stuff is just crazy stuff full of ideas, but I think a lot of people are turning on it now because it's been flattened out so much, try and make it more relatable to the Marvel standard publication of storytelling. But I feel like Hickman got to do some crazy stuff and then had to slowly but surely walk it back.
Right. Well, they were mentioning that on, I think it was iFanboy recently, and saying like, okay, Hickman did all of this and it was interesting, but at some point you have to find a way to end it because people expect you're going to go on to a different idea later, but there was so much to it that it's kind of hard to get out of it. It's
the same thing where he's sort of raising the bar, expecting that somebody else will come after him and, do the same. And I think what we're seeing, just concentrating on Hickman, because as I said before, the same thing happened with Morrison and the Seven Soldiers of Victory and his Final Crisis stuff, and also the new X-Men run. Same thing happened. You create all these new concepts, you introduce them, and then you say, all right, other people, you can play with these toys. And the problem is people don't. Now, Hickman, I feel, has gotten the furthest of anyone. Even the three we've mentioned, Kirby, Morrison, Hickman. Hickman's got the furthest because he did get people to come in. and work with it. And he did have other creative teams actually interact with these concepts. Not all of them have been successful. Arguably, the one I'm most excited about is the writer Al Ewing. I feel like he's sort of accepting the challenge and running with it. So he's doing some X-Men stuff now that Hickman's left that I will keep reading. I'll read Ewing stuff, and after coming off Immortal Hulk, I know he's got what it takes. But it's so funny to me that there's an earnestness in that approach to making comics for these publishers, where it's like, all right, I'll give you a bunch of toys for you to then disseminate and use, and people don't. And then they go back to what was before, which means you continually have this return. Now, some would say this is fan-driven, okay? That the fan base is inherently conservative, but I don't believe that's true. I think it's a publisher-driven anxiety.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, we have to always be able to reset it back to the old status quo at some point.
And what's fascinating about reading these comics is not only, and we've sort of been just saying ideas, but the nature of the ideas is so interesting. So with Transylvane, you've got this concept of the influence of media and how media can actually impact you and change you. And whether that's a debate that's happening at the time, particularly movies. It's about movies and horror. And I find that really, really interesting that he's taken this idea. And that's why I raised The Matrix Reloaded and this idea of seeing and watching oneself. That's just Jack Kirby straying into post-structuralist French philosophy. Like, it's really fascinating stuff. But then you have the bit later on with the sort of fake rock band at the discotheque who've got their boom tube technology and their strange musical instruments, and he's associating the New Gods concepts with the younger generation. And explicitly in that, you've got this idea of there's a younger generation coming up and their version of the future is unrecognizable to me. So I'm going to try and get ahead of it or communicate that idea of this is something I don't quite understand, but this is a free-floating metaphor, New Gods, boom tube, all that kind of stuff, that you can apply to these Harrys and Yippies and all these types coming up now. I don't, I'm not from this generation, I'm not part of it, but I'm interested in what its sort of future-oriented perspective, and that's what I think he's doing. He's not retrograde, he's not conservative, he's actually trying to move with the times. He's very interesting.
By the way, that group was called the San Diego 5-String Mob.
Amazing.
Coming up, Emmet continues to be fascinated by the Transylvane story, but we do get in some discussion of Kirby's final Jimmy Olsen story featuring villain Victor Volcano. Also, the rarity in superhero comics of characters who are normal people and stay that way. But first, a reminder to join us for trivia quizzes, reviews of The Amazing Spider-Man by Lee and Ditko, and more. Check out our goals and rewards at patreon.com/deconcomics. If you'd rather give a one-time donation, you can do so via PayPal by sending it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We appreciate your support.
Greetings from Wayne Manor Memoirs, a podcast dedicated to exploring the Batman mythos.
Each episode, we research a character, story, contributor, or piece of pop culture related or adjacent to the Dark Knight,
and try to understand why these topics are important to the Bat mythos. I'm Joe.
I'm Kendall, and some of our favorite topics include the transformation of Mr. Zero into Mr. Freeze,
the early appearances of the Riddler,
Booster Gold,
Commandi,
Jim Aparo,
and many, many more. Check out Wayne Manor Memoirs every other Friday, wherever you download your podcasts.
And follow us at Wayne Manor Memoirs on Facebook or at W Memoirs on Twitter.
Until next time, Bat Fanatics, be brave
and stay bold.
Last time I was saying that I thought the tone of the books kind of went all over the place And reading this batch, I don't know if it's just that I got used to it or if it kind of evened out, because it felt to me like the tone was more consistent. And it had humor as a more consistent part of it. And then just, all these outrageous things going on. But yeah, as far as the humor, I felt like the character of Superman was a little bit different from what I think of as Superman's personality. Because he was making more kind of jokes and even some sarcasm sometimes, and it just was kind of like, that's Superman? Maybe I'm just thinking too much of Superman from the first iteration of the Super Friends TV show in the 70s, who was pretty one-dimensional.
Right.
But, I don't really expect Superman to make sarcastic remarks like the one I put in my notes. In that first story, when Miss Conway, the secretary, is temporarily turned into a vampire.
Yes.
And Jimmy says, Miss Conway, your face. I mean, are you okay? And Clark is there saying, one side, diplomat.
But that's more in keeping with Siegel and Schuster's vision of him as being a sort of trickster. Like he was a bit sarcastic, and he was a bit of a bit tricky and a bit humorous. And I think you're right. I think over the decades, more and more writers have written him as being insufferably noble, and effectively erasing any trace of a personality from him. And I find that's a shame, because I think, what kind of perspective does somebody who is all-powerful and is sort of hiding amongst us, I can't see how that would produce somebody who would be maybe a bit wry in their perspective.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as a kid, I was never interested in Superman because he just seemed boring.
They made him boring. They made him boring.
Batman and Spider-Man were a lot more interesting.
Yeah, exactly. And I wonder if maybe there's a, Super Dickory, the website Super Dickory from back in the day, but all those covers are he's being really abusive to Lois and everything. And torturing his cast of supporting characters. I do wonder if maybe there was an overcorrection that happened in the wake of those things becoming well known. But again, I feel it's a shame, because I think he's a fascinating character if you look at him from the point of view of how would somebody as powerful as that get used to the idea of living amongst humans and loving humans and wanting to protect them, and still retain their sense of self. And how would that make them? I like, if you look at the Zack Snyder movies, famously, he's tortured by that responsibility, right? I think that's ridiculous. I think it's an interpretation. I've accepted that. It's an interpretation that people vibe with. I don't like it myself. That's my personal preference. But I also don't like him as a sort of, stuck in the mud, boring diplomat, to borrow his term. I like the Siegel and Schuster mocking character. I like the version of him here, where he's Jimmy and Superman in the Jack Kirby stuff are like squabbling brothers at times.
Yeah, well, that panel that you shared on Twitter, where Jimmy, so Superman is saying, I think this might be true and this is the case, and Jimmy is saying, I wish Clark were here, he could give us facts rather than opinions.
Yes.
What a diss of Superman, I thought.
It's incredible, but also, it's sort of, it's interesting because he's almost speaking more admiringly of Clark there than Superman. Like, he's talking about Clark as, well,
Clark's this journalist who's on top of the facts.
Yeah, he'll get you to the truth of the matter. You're just guessing, right?
You might be super strong, but you're not a journalist. You don't know.
Yeah, which follows on from the previous episode where we were talking about Olsen and the Newsboy Legion joining up, and one of the reasons is they resent Superman taking all the fun. Never mind taking all the credit. And they're saying, no, we can handle this weird stuff. We can actually, we love this stuff, and we're a bunch of rapscallions in a super truck. It's really, really interesting. But can we talk about I mean, can we talk about Count Dragoran?
Go ahead.
So this is the main character from Transylvane we get to know. He's styled as Dracula. He looks like a vampire. He's styled like Dracula. He, as you mentioned before, he takes control of Morgan Edge's PA in a weird display of vampiric abilities I don't think we've seen before, which is where beams come out of his eyes, travel to her bedroom, bite her in the neck, right? Which is the traditional method of vampires seducing.
I laughed at that. Like, oh, okay, so it's going to be the tooth marks, even though it was a ray shot from who knows how far away.
Which, again, there's something really interesting there because, he comes from a miniaturized planet which is being brainwashed by projected light, on his atmosphere. That's kind of interesting. But also, and I'll just do Darkseid. Darkseid shoots beams from his eyes that can send people through time and into oblivion. You can. So there's something. That's why I was saying there's a connection between Transylvane and Apocalypse. There's something weird going on here. And we, for the benefit of the listener who hasn't read these issues, Transylvane, the planet that's been conditioned by Hollywood horror movies to be obsessed with universal monsters, it's got horns. It's a planet with horns. It's just have to quickly get them out of the way. Yeah, so he's here. He's looking for the scientist responsible for putting him and his people in this situation where they're due an apocalypse. They're going to be wiped out by this terrible event. And what's the guy's name? Dabney Donovan.
Yeah.
So, again, this is where, the Stan Lee alliteration is well known.
Mm-hmm.
Is Kirby, tipping his hat to that? Is he attempting to replicate that?
Yeah,
Dabney Donovan has no flow at all. It's a terrible name.
I did feel sometimes that he was sort of cribbing from what he thought Stan would do. But sometimes doesn't do it as well. Kind of the trying to do the Carnival Barker thing with the cover blurbs and the next issue blurbs. And I mean, I've seen criticism, like in the Reisman article I talked about last time from Vulture, where he criticizes the dialogue in general, that it just sounds too kind of awkward.
Yeah, and then you've got Count Dragoran. He's not Dracula, but he almost is. You've got Lupek, the Wolfman. So they're punning names, if you like. But I really find it fascinating that these monsters come from a world obsessed with monsters. They have powers. They are using a form of magic. At one point, he uses a spell which he assures us, is the equivalent in his world of an atomic blast or something. But on this sort of maximalized world that we live on, it's the equivalent of knockout gas because the scale has changed. This is a comic. These two issues, they're stuffed. The panels are stuffed with concepts and ideas and this notion of what Transylvane is and how it relates to cinema and how it relates to the idea of looking and watching and being observed and seeing. I think you could write a full academic paper just on this. Just on this. And Superman and Jimmy just sort of blunder in. This Donovan character, we don't meet him.
No, we never see him.
We see the evidence of his super science. We're told that he was evil. There is something deeply sadistic about the situation he's let unfold on Transylvane. And Superman's solution is to just change the conditioning. And this sort of moral choice is to replace horror movies with westerns as the conditioning element.
Well, yeah, a musical western, Oklahoma.
You're right, it's Oklahoma. Oh my God. Why couldn't we... The idea of Jack Kirby doing a musical comic book with everybody dressed up as cowboys, I would die for that. That would make my day.
Transylvane, maybe 100 years later, had like everybody in cowboy gear doing square dancing.
Yes. Yes. I'm up for it. Absolutely.
Planet Square Dance.
Yeah. And, there could be all sorts of schools of thought around the kinds of musical that they do, and maybe you could get some factions based on that. I feel like he was just generously lobbing so much stuff at the page here. And it's tragic that people didn't take him up on it. And Transylvane and Count Dragoran and these characters, they come back. They come back in later years. Ladron has done some stuff with them. And I think they come back around the Crisis era or after Crisis, not quite sure. But it sounds like they're just, vampires and werewolves and, which wasn't the point. The point was that they'd been altered. In this sort of hand-wavy way, but like there's the concept is interesting. Whereas I think when they come back, there's this attempt to actually try and explain the genetic science behind them. And I'm going, no, don't explain it. It's magical.
Well, it's kind of like Watchmen was a good superhero comic. Like, that's not the point.
Yeah, it's a good comic. Yeah, the panel of Transylvane, the splash page, I think it's the next issue, Genocide Spray. That's issue 143. So the introduction of Transylvane with the floating cameras orbiting it, and the giant rock horns, and, Superman and Jimmy sort of preparing to descend into it. Like, that's epic. What a weird idea. What an immensely weird idea.
Yes.
I'm absolutely in love with it.
So then we have the Scotland stuff and the Evil Factory, and then the last two issues of this batch, 147, 148, Victor Volcanum. Is this guy who had some kind of a floating ship that landed in a volcano, and he adapted to it, started eating like volcanic stuff. He did some kind of science to it and made it edible, and now he like drinks flame and stuff, and he's decided he wants to take over the world. And so Superman and Jimmy and the Newsboy Legion have to defeat him. I felt like this... Well, I mean, sure, the volcanic stuff was a new idea, but, some guy wants to take over the world is not terribly original. Right,
yeah. Yeah, it's Monarch of All He Subdues. Is that the name of the story?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's another, power fantasy type character. I find it interesting, if you look at page 3, the bottom panel, the bottom right panel.
Which issue is this?
This is the one I just mentioned the title of. So let me just get that for you. It is issue 148.
Yeah, okay.
If you look at issue 148 on panel 3, the very last panel, there's an image of Victor Volcanum, and he's in a sort of bubble. He's talking to Superman.
Yeah.
But the detail on the face, even the look of that, it looks like classic comics, actually. It looks like an older style of art. And I know we talked about Vince Scaletta reworking Kirby stuff and smoothing it out a bit, but this looks odd.
I heard somebody was pointing out it might have been Al Plastino or somebody else. Coletta was inking, but apparently they had someone else retouching the faces of Superman and Jimmy.
Right, okay, yeah, because they are more detailed, but there's an older style, and it's not quite in keeping with Kirby's style, which is, has a bit of dynamism to it from the fact that he's just, it's so much of it's about movement, it's not at rest. Whereas this, I was immediately taken out by that for some reason. I was like, what's going on? And it continues. I'm just flicking to the pages. It continues. The faces continue to have this, particularly Volcanum. Volcanum looks like a Flash Gordon villain. He looks like Ming the Merciless, but even to the point where he has the same features, and the illustrative style is the same. Yeah, I found it odd.
Mm-hmm.
He is not a terribly interesting antagonist.
No, and then unfortunately, that's it. That's where Kirby's run ends. As I mentioned last time, DC got so excited about when he created Commandy and the Demon that they took him off Jimmy Olsen and suspended Forever People and the New Gods, which was a terrible letdown for him. So he clearly had plans for what was going to come after this that I don't know if any of that got put in that, what was it called? The thing that he did in 1984, the Hunger Dogs.
Yeah, Hunger Dogs. I was thinking about the Hunger Dogs in relation to the, what are they called? The Dog of Doom or the Chaos Dog, whatever it was that Transylvane was going to be destroyed by.
Oh. Yeah, I was struggling to remember also.
But yeah, I like this idea of dog representing the apocalypse. It's an odd idea. Demon Dog. There's the robotic Demon Dog. But you go from Demon Dog to the Hunger Dogs, which is more allegorical when we get to that graphic novel. But yeah, this idea of everything ending in blood and people being torn apart. I can see where the dog becomes a sort of metaphor for Kirby in that respect of the apocalypse. But yeah, he sort of concludes his epic with that. But we hadn't even got to second base yet with this stuff. Like this is, it's all set up. It's all set up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a setup, and then finish.
It's maddening. But yeah, and then Volcanum, maybe could have been an interesting character. I kind of feel you're right. I think you might have just been sort of, all right, you're making me finish up. Let's just have this. Whatever. There you go. He eats volcanoes. Yeah, sure. Whatever. But that last panel on page 22 is quite lovely. The idea of stand by, Metropolis, we're coming home. That's quite, it's quite sweet in a way.
Mm-hmm.
As a sign off. And then we have one last Tales of the DNA Project, which again, all these concepts.
Right, yeah. Some of these issues have these backup stories that I was wondering, is this going to introduce us to something that's going to be in the Jimmy stories? No. I didn't see these concepts come back again.
Think, they weren't necessarily going to be the Jimmy Olsen. But they were, I think, being introduced so that they could become a whole other, I use the phrase again, stable of characters for other creators to use.
Mm-hmm. Maybe somebody else would build on it.
To your knowledge, has the DNA aliens come back?
I have no idea, but I'm not a big DC reader, so I'm not the person to ask.
Yeah, and you're right. Like the next one. Jimmy Olsen and a cub reporter, Meg, go on the trail of a mad scientist and his death ray. So, yeah. Morgan Edge is in it. But, we go back to this. Oh, it's the first appearance of Jim Corrigan. Oh, that's interesting. Jim Corrigan, who will later become the Spectre. But,
okay.
Yes, this is sort of going back to basics. Going back to the standard types of stories. Whereas Jimmy and Superman being sort of lost and buffeted about by all these subterranean societies and miniature worlds and other dimensions and dark gods and all this. It was just so heady, so amazing.
Mm-hmm.
So now I've got to look forward to the Forever People and being disappointed knowing that this is never going to be resolved.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Great. Can't wait.
By the way, do you know why Jimmy Olsen ever had his own title?
No.
I found this out.
Yes.
So Jimmy and Lois also, Lois had her own title. Right. And it was because the characters got so popular when the TV show was on in the 50s that they decided to,
I can see that.
build on that and put out give the characters their own titles. So that makes sense. But yeah, I always wondered why does Jimmy Olsen have his own comic book? He's not even a superhero. And it wasn't like, sometimes Marvel will have a normal character who stands around a lot and, interacts with superheroes, and then eventually they'll make that one into a superhero too. Like, does everybody have to be a superhero?
I mean, the obvious example of that is Alias, where you had a character who was sort of on the sidelines, who was acting...
Jessica Jones.
Who was acting like a private detective, and then it turns out that they were heavily traumatized, having attempted to be a superhero. It didn't work out. They had a lot of PTSD. They become this sort of drunken wreck, dysfunctional person, and then ultimately they were sort of redeemed by becoming a superhero again, if you like, or the wife of a superhero who occasionally is also a superhero. It's interesting, isn't it, that you can't just be an ordinary person in this world. And what's interesting about Jimmy is that he's always Jimmy. Now, that said, he can sometimes be turned into a superpowered Neanderthal or a tortoise man, but he always returns to Jimmy. Like Snapper Carr got superpowers. You can't have an ordinary person in these worlds. And I find that disappointing, because you think of the perspective of, again, this idea for whatever about Superman not having a personality because we're not actually exploring what that would mean. Being an ordinary person, knowing all these superheroes and superhumans and supervillains and these strange, fantastical worlds, and navigating that successfully, and then coming back and telling a story about it, that's really interesting. But, we can't have that.
Another example I thought of is, I think practically every supporting character in the Hulk now has Hulk powers.
The aforementioned...
Amadeus Cho became a Hulk, and General Ross became a Hulk, and I think his daughter became a Hulk. Everybody's got Hulk
She's
powers.
the Harpy now. And as I mentioned before, Al Ewing's The Immortal Hulk gets really into that. Explores the impact. And it's almost fascinating, because over the years, characters became Hulks or some variety of Hulk on the basis of doing their own experiment, or being experimented on by supervillains or blah blah blah. But what I liked about Al Ewing's take was there's this idea almost, and there's a bunch of mystical stuff going on there too, which I won't get into here, but there's this idea of the gamma radiation irradiating all the people in Banner's life. So Hulk himself is like this spreading cancer, and that all these other people are being infected and pulled into Hulk and becoming changed and transformed and metastasizing along with him. And I thought that was a really interesting idea. As you say, it keeps growing, all these characters, and then the people in their life also become some variety of Hulk creature. It keeps going. And the Hulk stuff is just really, really interesting. Now, Ewing took it a step further in his Guardians of the Galaxy book, where he on panel completely redefines Star-Lord. Star-Lord becomes an entirely different character in his latest Guardians of the Galaxy run due to Al Ewing, and it's really interesting stuff. And it's basically like a sequence out of a Alejandro Jodorowsky movie when it happens. And Star-Lord isn't just a guy with guns anymore. I don't know, maybe he wasn't in the beginning, but because of the movies, he's certainly become known as that. Whereas when Ewing's finished with him, he's like a solar priest or something like that. It was really weird, but I loved it.
Okay, so in the future we will go ahead with a batch of Forever People issues, 2 through 8. So it'll take a little time off from it, but we will come back to it before too long. So
looking forward to it.
Jimmy Olsen comics are published, of course, by DC. You can help the Deconstructing Comics family of podcasts by joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/deconcomics. And go to deconstructingcomics.com to connect to us on Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube, to shop on Amazon to support the show, and to find links to subscribe to the podcast. Our theme is by J.B. Anderton. If you're looking for some constructive feedback on your comic, send it to us and we'll critique it on our spin-off podcast, Critiquing Comics. Send it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We'll read at least 30 pages of it and critique it on the show. Next week, Kumar and Emmet discuss the book EC Comics, Race, Shock, and Social Protest by Kiana Whitted. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.